I asked Peter Singer, the most influential living ethicist, whether he'd set Ted Bundy to eternal torment to give everyone else eternal bliss. Recently, I attended a lecture by Peter Singer, a contemporary philosopher most famous for his strong thought experiments that have shaped modern ethics, especially in animal ethics and effective altruism. But before I get into my question, let me first explain what Singer is most famous for and what his ethical framework looks like. Perhaps his most well-known example is that of the drowning child thought experiment. Imagine you're walking to school or work and you see a child drowning in front of you in a shallow pond, but you just bought new shoes of $100 and saving this child would ruin them. Are you morally obligated to save this child? Most people say yes, and Singer adds that distance doesn't matter morally. So if you're obligated to save the child in front of you, you're also obligated to save a child across the world. For example, by donating to charities that provide malaria nets. Link to that in the description, by the way. Singer's broader ethical worldview is grounded in the form of utilitarianism, and he believes that what matters most is reducing suffering. This includes both human and non-human animals. Since animals can suffer too, Singer argues that we should avoid eating meat, support animal rights, and generally do whatever reduces suffering. Now classically, utilitarianism means promoting the greatest good for the greatest number, but Singer's version deviates from this in an important way, and that is what my question was meant to explore. During the lecture, mostly focused on animal ethics, there was a Q&A section. And one of my favorite quotes from a teacher is, "The biggest compliment you can give a philosopher after they've written their entire life's work is to try to take it down with the strongest arguments you can think of." I couldn't agree more, as it shows it's worth responding to, and it furthers the pursuit of truth and wisdom. So I enthusiastically raised my hand like Hermione, and the lady with the microphone seemed to signal that I was next. And the previous questions had laid the perfect groundwork for mine. But just before I had the chance to speak, the moderator ended the event. There was a book signing afterwards, but the moderator also said that you could not engage in the discussion. So I waited. I let everyone get an autograph, got one myself as well, and when the queue was empty, I approached Singer and said I wanted to ask him a question. To which the lady next to him said that I could follow him until he got into his cab. So I asked, "Mr. Singer, if I understand you correctly, you care so much about animals because you want to minimize suffering and you're a utilitarian." To which he nodded and said, "Yes, that's correct." So I followed up, "Imagine we could make a deal. One person, let's say someone truly evil like Ted Bundy, would suffer for all eternity, but in exchange for this, every sentient being who has ever lived and will ever live will enjoy eternal bliss forever. And if we reject the deal, there's no afterlife at all. Everyone's experience would cease to exist when they die. Would you take the deal?" To which Singer replied, "It's really a matter of infinite suffering. If it were not infinite suffering, it might be a different matter. But he would not take the deal." Before we could dive deeper, he got into his cab and he was gone. But I at least got an answer. Now I think this dilemma poses a serious challenge for Singer, no matter how he answers it. Because if he accepts it, then he allows one person to suffer eternally so that others can be happy, which seems to contradict his priority of wanting to minimize suffering. And if he rejects the deal, then he's failing to produce the greatest good for the greatest number, which breaks from classical utilitarianism. So, how does he justify it? To steal Singer's position, I think he would say he's not a classical utilitarian. Instead of seeking to maximize pleasure, his priority is minimizing suffering. He still accepts the hedonistic principle, which says that only suffering and pleasure have intrinsic moral value. The utility of this principle he sees very differently from classical utilitarians. They might want to do a net calculus of what's the most good versus most bad in a sort of a min-maxing way. But Singer's priority is minimizing suffering. And that's a defensible stance. But then let's be clear, this isn't classical utilitarianism. Because a classical utilitarian would accept the Bundy deal, because it produces the greatest net good. Singer wouldn't, which suggests that for him, minimizing suffering trumps maximizing happiness. But if that still counts as utilitarianism, why couldn't someone flip it and say, I'm a utilitarian too. I prioritize maximizing happiness, even if others suffer greatly. It's the same structure. So, let's try it. Imagine, everyone's doomed to eternal torment except for one incredible person like Gandhi. He gets to live in eternal bliss on the backs of everyone suffering. If the goal is to maximize happiness, the deal should be accepted using the same logic. But of course, this feels monstrous. And if we reject it as absurd, even though it follows the same moral reasoning Singer uses, just flipped, then Singer's view becomes questionable too, at least as a utilitarian framework. So either both are legitimate forms of utilitarianism, and one leads to absurdity, or neither is, and we're no longer even dealing with utilitarianism at all. Since he departs from classical utilitarianism, the question becomes, what principled boundary is doing the work here? Is there a quantitative threshold of suffering that makes an outcome unacceptable? Is some suffering qualitatively disqualifying no matter the benefits? Or, as Singer, perhaps implicitly, adopted a moral rule, a kind of side constraint against extreme harm? If infinite suffering is uniquely disqualifying, then Singer's view starts to resemble a deontological limit, a line that even the greatest good cannot cross. And while Singer may call this position utilitarianism, it arguably points to something else. Let's push the thought experiment further. Singer objected to the deal because it involved infinite suffering. So let's change it. Let's say Ted Bundy suffers the worst torment imaginable, but only for 1 second, and in exchange, every other sentient being experiences 1 million years of bliss. Would that be morally acceptable? If you say yes, then what if we repeat it? What if Bundy suffers every second, and for every second, the rest of us receives another 1 million years of paradise, stacked on top of the last? Bliss without end, but 1 second at a time, at the cost of one man's eternal suffering. Is this justifiable? And if not, where exactly do we draw the line? If 1 second of maximal torment is acceptable, what about 2? What about 356? At what exact point does it become too much? And more importantly, why there? This opens up a deeper problem. If you allow just 1 second of extreme suffering to justify mass bliss and have no principled limit on how often you can do it, haven't we just recreated the original deal? The very deal we supposedly reject? So then we have to ask, is it infinite suffering that's uniquely disqualifying? Or is it maximal suffering that makes a trade-off immoral, no matter how short it is? But if maximal suffering is off limits, even for 1 second, then Singer's ethics seems to imply strong constraints on harm, constraints that can easily override even vast benefits. But this is not how utilitarianism typically works. To be fair, perhaps this is precisely Singer's point. Maybe in some cases of extreme suffering, he draws a hard moral boundary, a kind of a quasi-deontological limit within his utilitarian framework. And if that's true, he's not just minimizing suffering, he's refusing to treat some suffering as morally fungible, no matter the upside. Personally, I would not take the deal either, but for different reasons than Singer's. My view is closer to a Rawlsian one. Behind a veil of ignorance, you don't know who you will be. And if you end up being the person that suffers eternally, then clearly you would never consent. Eternal, maximal suffering is the single worst possible thing that could happen to any person. And since it is the worst possible fate, I don't think we can morally impose that on anyone, even for the greatest possible good. Now, maybe there are noble souls out there who believe they could carry this burden for all others. I doubt that. If we could give people a glimpse of what maximal suffering feels like, just for 1 second, and then let them decide if they would choose that for all eternity, I think no one would. And even if there were someone that self-sacrificing, I think it's way too extreme to ever ask that of someone. No one should have to endure that. So I too would reject the deal. But what about the 1 second version? Let's return to the veil of ignorance. You don't know who you will be. So, could you let yourself suffer maximal torment for 1 second in exchange for 1 million years of bliss for everyone else? It seems so short, right? It's just 1 second. Maybe you could. But what about your loved ones? Your child, your partner, your sibling, your mother, your best friend, suffering the worst possible thing that can be suffered for just 1 second? Could you bear that? And if not, can you in good conscience prescribe that fate to anyone else? There's also another problem. What does 1 second of maximal suffering even mean? What could that be? What does it feel like to have the human capacity for suffering pushed to its absolute limit, condensed into 1 single second? That might deserve a video of its own. But for now, I would love to hear your thoughts. Would you take the original Bundy deal? What about the 1 second deal? Would you let yourself suffer it? And what about your loved ones? Let me know in the comments. Thank you so much for watching. I've been just a philosophy student, and I hope to see you in the next one.